in my argument is that 1985 and 1986, in the townships of Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage, that was Apartheid Stalingrad, Battle of Stalingrad. That was at the time when they were fought to a standstill. Before that, as with the Nazi army, before Stalingrad, they won every encounter they were involved in. After Stalingrad, they went through a series of sapping defeats until 3 years later they were finished. And the same happened to the men of Apartheid. They won every encounter with black mobilization until the Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage townships in 1985 and 1986. There they were blunted. They weren't stopped completely, as was the Nazi army, but from there on they had 3 years of sapping defeats until eventually negotiations had to happen because there was clearly a stalemate in the balance of power. Thank you, Saka. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It's wonderful and very thrilling to be with good people in Craddock. Melissa and I come almost every year for the Stravers Fest, and it's one of the highlights of our year. And this is new to me, and well, thank you again for the honour of being here. I'd like just to talk about two things quickly. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the book itself. And then after that, I'd like to talk about why it was written and how it was written and how it's developing. The book itself is entitled Apartheid Stalingrad, which is quite a complicated title, but let me explain to you why it has that title. The core of the story is this. On the 10th of October 1979, a young man by the name of Tosimile Botha came to Port Elizabeth's townships, and he amalgamated the KwaZulu Residents Association and the Zwidi Residents Association on that date, 10th of October 1979. And he began the first mobilization, or modern mobilization, after the 1976 period in South Africa. He lasted 3 months. On the 10th of January 1970, he was wiped out. 1980, sorry, he was wiped out. He was banned. He was no longer allowed to be in any place of formal employment, and he worked for a Ford Motor Company, so that was his job gone. He ended up selling potatoes at the side of the road, starved, and went out of the country. The organization itself, which had become known as PEBCO, the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Organization, was closed down. His fellow executives were also banned and also detained, and that was the end of PEBCO. A black mobilization organizing in the end of 1979, beginning of 1980, lasted 3 months and it was finished. Exactly 10 years later, on the 2nd of February 1990, as we all remember, suddenly all of the black organizations were unveiled and were allowed to mobilize openly and freely. Mandela and his comrades were out of jail. The exiles were coming home. Free and full political activity was allowed, and we were irrevocably on the way to a democracy. What happened in those 10 years? What happened in 1979, 1980, and between there and 1990, in those 10 years, to have changed things so irrevocably? That's the core issue of my book, to look at what happened in the 10 years of the 1980s that brought us to a democracy. And one of the arguments that I put forward is that one of the main issues, probably the main issue, was the township revolt of those years of the 1980s that had been formulated by the UDF and orchestrated by the UDF initially, and then again its own level of control as it went on. But in the year 1985 and 1986, in the Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage townships, I argue that at that time the apartheid war juggernaut was fought to a standstill and couldn't continue to do as it always had done, which was putting down black organizations. My argument is that 1985 and 1986, in the townships of Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage, that was Apartheid Stalingrad, Battle of Stalingrad. That was at the time when they were fought to a standstill. Before that, as with the Nazi army, before Stalingrad, they won every encounter they were involved in. After Stalingrad, they went through a series of sapping defeats until 3 years later they were finished. And the same happened to the men of Apartheid. They won every encounter with black mobilization until the Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage townships in 1985 and 1986. There they were blunted. They weren't stopped completely, as was the Nazi army, but from there on they had 3 years of sapping defeats until eventually negotiations had to happen because there was clearly a stalemate in the balance of power. That's the story that I'm telling, the story of the 1980s and how in the township revolt of Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage, the whole thing changed for South Africa. Now, as I'm sure I'm looking at a room of people who write, so I'm very conscious about being cautious here because I'm probably the most inexperienced writer in this room. But one of the challenges that I found I faced telling a non-fiction story of that nature was, where do you start and where do you end? This is not fiction. I'm not inventing these characters. I can't just put them on the pages as I feel like to be. There are living people here. And where do you start to put this whole story together? And I was advised by a good friend that start early, but tell the first parts quickly until you get to the density of the story when the detail will swell out and it will become obvious that that is your story. And I tried to do it like that. And I went back quite a long way. I went back, in fact, to 1942 in Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage. In that year, a man and his 22-year-old lanky son came from the Transkei to Port Elizabeth and to get involved in wage work in Port Elizabeth. The son was a man by the name of Raymond Mshlaba. And his arrival in Port Elizabeth in 1942 was the catalyst, was the turning point of the opposition to white minority rule in our area and I think in our country in many respects. Obviously there had been issues before that, but for the first time ever, black organizations became organized, became integrated in their own ways of controlling the issues and really started taking the battle to the people of apartheid. That was 1942. There were a whole series of bus boycotts and things that Mshlaba and his people got involved in, and almost always they won. It was amazing. They really got themselves into shape. Then, of course, as we know, in 1948 came, there was this tsunami in the white community when the Verenigde National Party took control of South Africa and made it very plain that they were going to run things differently from the geriatric party of Smuts. And they did, and they started bringing apartheid into the statute books quickly, determinedly. And the ANC had to make decisions, and they made decisions, and they went into the Defiance campaign of 1952, which again in the Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage townships was by far the most determined campaign in the country. More black people were jailed in Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage than anywhere else in South Africa in the Defiance campaign of 1950. And Raymond Mshlaba was behind all of that. Then things sort of petered out for a while. Things were difficult. They were put down, there's no question about it. The people of apartheid won that one. And on it moved into 1960. The Sharpeville, many people in this room will remember the Sharpeville uprising and the problems that followed from that. Again, a state of emergency. Again, the whole thing was put down. And again, it couldn't go anywhere from there. The ANC then decided to go underground. They formed Umkhonto we Sizwe. They got things going, and in 1963, the sabotage campaigns of Umkhonto began. And again, in Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage, they were intensely more determinedly fought than anywhere else in the country. There were more bombs, more destruction in our area than anywhere else. And then, of course, it all changed. 4 trials at the time. One was the trial where the Umkhonto we Sizwe leadership in Port Elizabeth was captured. Kuzimini, Kayenga, and Mashashlo, they were all executed, they were hanged, and that was devastating, obviously, to the ANC in the area. Then came the Rivonia trial when Mshlaba and Mbeki, the core of the ANC, were put in jail for life. Then came the Little Rivonia trial when Wilton Mukai was put in jail for life, and the ANC was wiped out in the area. Or so they thought. But of course it didn't work like that. And things went on. They went on until 1976, and it all blew up again, and again Port Elizabeth was very central in this whole process until in 1979, Josimila Botha, as I've mentioned, came and began the first mobilization of the modern era, and he was put down. Must we start thinking about closing up? 5 minutes, is it? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay, right. Thank you. So that was it. The core of my book is the 1980s, as I mentioned, which I cut into 5 sections from 1980 to 1984. 1985, which was the definitive year. I'll just mention very quickly what happened in that year, because I'm sure we all do remember it. It began with highly contested terrain in Uitenhage, particularly Tana Bukla. And then, of course, on the 21st of March 1985 was the Langa massacre in Langa and Uitenhage, which totally changed the terrain of struggle in South Africa. After that, the explosion was just absolutely all-absorbing. It was like an atomic bomb had gone off in the townships. You will recall the dreadful massacre of the Kini family that followed immediately after the Langa massacre. Then came the assassination and murder of the Pepco 3. Then came the assassination and murder of Matthew Conway. All of this happened in Port Elizabeth. It was, and the death squads were roaming the townships. It was incredible. The amazingly brave consumer boycott that the UDF began, and followed by the massive funeral of Conway and Onnetwington. I take you right through the 1980s, through what I call the three wars of apartheid. The wars of the Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage townships, number one. The second war, which was the Namibian War of Independence, which was lost by the men of apartheid in the Angola bush in 1988. And finally, the War of the Indus Massacre, which was the war in the killing fields in Natal and the Inkatha hospitals in the Transvaal, where 15,000 civilians were murdered by the Inkatha operators, grotesquely funded and organized by the South African security forces. Eventually, all three of those wars were lost, and we became a democracy. That's the story that I tell. It ends with Mandela coming to Port Elizabeth in 1990 and the extraordinary events that followed from that. That's the book. Now, why did I write this book, and how did it happen? It happened that in 1986, I and a wonderful man by the name of Andrew Savage, some of you might have known him, we founded the Human Rights Trust in Port Elizabeth, and I worked in this area from 1986 onwards. So there was a sense in which I was very much an operator in this process. I kept an extensive archive, which I've always kept with me, despite the fact that the times have changed. And when lockdown happened, I went into that archive and I decided that the time was right to try and use some of it, because if it doesn't get used now, it will never be used and it will just be lost. And so I brought all of that together into the story, and I've taken it and made what I can out of it. Now, was it all worth it? Yeah, was it all worth it? And let me just, as I conclude this, I've sent the document that I finished to 10 people, many of whom gave me generous comments, and I'd just like to mention some of them to you to give you a feeling for what could be happening here. The first comment I'd like to make is from Albie Sachs, who I think all of you know, a most extraordinary man. And in 11 words, he summarized exactly what I had been trying to do with what I was writing. Albie wrote that it's a lovely read with lively energy and some great detail. Now that's exactly what I have tried to do. A lovely read, lively energy and great detail. I have not tried to write a PhD thesis. This is a book that people can read. It flows, it has life, it has energy. And I've done my best to do that. The second set of comments I'd like to make is from Professor Tom Lodge, that many of you would know also. He, of course, is one of the most famous South African historians and political scientists who writes on the history of South Africa. His book, Black Politics in South Africa since 1945, is the classic in that period. Tom generously again read it and wrote, from the 1950s through to the 1990s, the black communities living around Port Elizabeth would fight the main battles against apartheid, in scale and duration unmatched elsewhere in South Africa. From the middle of the 1980s, this resistance would deliver the decisive actions that would bring about the advent of a democratic state. Rory Riordan can tell the story with unusual authority, for he was there when all this struggle happened and it came to its climax. To this story, he brings the investigative skills of a superb journalist, the industry and care of a trained academic researcher, and the passion of an engaged witness. I'm very proud of that. I think it's a wonderful compliment, and I hope that my book, when it's finally published, will live up to that. Another very generous comment came from a gentleman in the back of this room, Professor Etienne van Heerden, who said that moving forward, this book will be regarded as an indispensable text in our understanding of that turbulent period. So I hope it will be of some use in that regard. I have been very lucky in having had Jacana accepted to publish, and it's now gone through the editing process and it's beginning the typesetting. I'd never published a book before. I had no idea it was as complicated as it is. But Jacana, I think, are the most extraordinary people. They publish 50 books a year about it. They're all by South African authors. They're all local books and very often by unknown people. And I think that's entirely commendable. And I think all of the other publishers tie into the international market and get their money out of that one. Chicano do it all. They keep it together by keeping South African authors on the road. I'm very proud that they published it, and I'm very happy that they have. Thank you.